America. A nation on fire. By the mid-1800s, this land was a blur of ambition. Cities were exploding in population. Factories were running non-stop. Railroads were stretching west, mile by mile. Everything was growing faster than it could be managed. However, all of this monumental surge, this American dream taking shape, was hinged on one fundamental thing: meat. Not luxury, not excess. Food produced in massive, constant quantities. Because you couldn't build booming cities or fuel hard-working factories on empty stomachs. People needed sustenance that was reliable, affordable, high in protein, so they can work harder, and most importantly, available in vast amounts. But the problem wasn't production. America already had food. In fact, far more than it needed. The real problem was, it wasn't where it was needed. Far to the south, beyond the reach of factories and cities, lay a place that barely felt like the same country at all. Texas, the southern edge of the United States. A vast, untamed land with law thinner than the soil. Texas wasn't organized like the rest of America. It wasn't fenced. It wasn't regulated. It wasn't even fully controlled. It was open space on a scale most people today can't imagine. Endless grasslands, wide skies, no clear borders. And across those plains moved wealth on four legs. Cattle. Millions of them. Descended from Spanish ranching traditions, these herds had been breeding and multiplying for decades, roaming freely across land that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. They were longhorns, hardened by heat, drought, and distance. Tough animals that survived where others couldn't. They were alive, they were healthy, and they were almost worthless. In Texas, a cow was worth less than the bullets it would take to kill it. But in Chicago or New York, the same animal could be worth a fortune, feeding families, workers, entire neighborhoods. Not because it was better meat, but because it was closer to hungry mouths. So, technically, two Americas existed at the same time, one drowning in cattle, the other starving for it. And between them lay distance, a crisis measured not in money, but in miles. In the 1800s, that distance was brutal. Between Texas and the northern markets lay rivers with no bridges, territories with no laws, and land so empty that weeks could pass without seeing another human being. There were no maps you could trust, no supply stations, no guarantees. Out of desperation, local ranchers tried loading cattle onto boats. Too slow, too expensive, and the animals panicked. Too many were lost this way. So they tried slaughtering the cattle locally and shipping the meat. But the meat spoiled before it ever reached the markets. Then they tried waiting for the railroads to come south. But the railroads didn't come. So the only option left was movement.
Route here through the nation saves us a week.
Too risky. The rivers are high this time of year.
We go west.
The cattle would be driven north, on foot, until they reached Steel. Railheads began to appear at the edges of civilization. Towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita. These places weren't destinations. They were handoff points, where the wild met the industrial world. where hooves met iron rails. But to reach them, herds had to travel anywhere from 600 to 1,000 miles, at 3 miles an hour, for months, so they can be loaded in trains and can further travel another 1,000 miles. A single herd could contain 2,000 animals, sometimes more, each one unpredictable, each one capable of panic. And panic meant certain death. Cattle crushed under hooves, men dragged, horses broken. This wasn't farming anymore. It was logistics on a moving battlefield. And it demanded a new kind of worker.
Don't let 'em stray.
Men who could ride 12 hours a day without rest. Men who understood weather before clouds formed. Men who could control animals not with force, but with patience and instinct. That job didn't exist before this moment. So America invented it. Cowboys. They weren't born from romance or rebellion. They were born from necessity, from a supply chain stretched to its breaking point. Every drive north was a gamble. Across the towering orange canyons, the herd moved like a river of dust and horns. Narrow cliffs and endless shadows turned each step into a test of courage. Every river crossing was a risk. And every night, a test of discipline. Because one loud sound could send thousands of cattle running blindly into the dark. Yet, they kept going, through storms that shattered tents and swept rivers into valleys. They slept on the ground, with nothing but the stars for shelter, eating what they could kill or carry. As if the cattle didn't move, the cities didn't eat. If the cities didn't eat, factories stopped. And if factories stopped, America's expansion stalled. Behind every successful cattle drive, something else followed. People. Where cattle moved, money moved. And where money moved, settlement followed. Railheads like Abilene and Dodge City didn't stay small for long. They exploded almost overnight. What began as a muddy platform beside a rail line became saloons, stockyards, hotels, banks, blacksmiths, grocers, outfitters, entire towns built around the predictable arrival of herds and cowboys. The cowboy didn't just deliver cattle, they delivered population. Farmers followed the trails, settling along rivers and crossings. Merchants followed the cowboys, selling supplies. Railroad companies followed both, extending tracks deeper into the interior. The cattle trails became the first economic arteries of the West. And slowly, the map changed. What had once been empty grassland gained names. What had once been lawless gained sheriffs. And what had once been temporary camps became permanent towns. The cowboy didn't build cities with bricks. He made them possible by making the land useful. Because once cattle could move reliably, land had value. And once land had value, people fought to own it. This is where the West truly began to transform. Open land became claimed land, trails became borders, and freedom began to shrink. Barbed wire arrived. Cheap, simple, devastating. Suddenly, the open range wasn't open anymore. Ranchers fenced land, farmers protected crops, and trails that had existed for decades were cut apart overnight. But just when the West was finally thriving, the law struggled to keep up. As towns grew, railroads stretched further, and land gained value. Sheriffs only existed on paper while on the ground. Power often belonged to whoever had the money, the muscle, or the guns. Cattle rustlers became legends, stealing thousands of dollars worth of animals in a single night. Outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid thrived because wealth and law were unevenly distributed. The American government was facing major losses, but there was nothing effective they could do. As the West was huge, with towns often hundreds of miles apart, there simply weren't enough lawmen to cover the territory. Outlaws could hide in the open plains, forests, or border areas. The telegraph lines existed but weren't everywhere. Transportation was rough. Courts and prisons were scarce. Tracking down criminals over hundreds of miles was almost impossible. So the government prioritized building railroads, claiming land, and encouraging settlement over policing crime. They wanted the West settled and productive, while the West was finding ways to make easy money. Speculators manipulated prices. Railroad companies bribed officials, and merchants charged outrageous rates for the supplies cowboys and settlers needed to survive. The very lifeblood of the West, the cattle, the railheads, the rivers, became battlegrounds for power and profit. Across the border, a quieter kind of crime took root. Smugglers moved goods, alcohol, tobacco, and even opiates across territories that had no real law. Even the criminals could easily escape across borders. Jurisdictional issues meant local authorities couldn't always pursue them legally. These activities laid the foundations of the cartels and mafia that are even now shown in the news. Although, that's another topic. But the chaos in the West couldn't just last forever. Slowly, order began to creep in, like sunlight over the plains at dawn. Railroads didn't just bring goods, they brought law, money, and predictability. Telegraph lines stitched towns together, making communication faster than any outlaw could flee. Sheriffs started to matter again, backed by bigger networks of marshals and judges. Posse rides turned into organized policing. Banks, merchants, and ranchers began to collaborate, protecting their interests through contracts and security instead of guns alone. Fences, once seen as the end of freedom, became the backbone of structure. Barbed wire divided land, sure, but it also defined property, stabilized markets, and stopped stampedes that once destroyed livelihoods. Water rights, once fought over in endless skirmishes, were formalized. Town councils, courts, and trade regulations slowly brought predictability to a lawless land. The cattle kept moving, now more safely, more efficiently. Herds were no longer at the mercy of stampedes or rustlers alone. Stockyards, railheads, and organized drives meant meat reached the northern cities reliably. Chicago and New York were fed, factories stayed running, and families ate. The Cowboys' job shifted from raw survival to skilled management, logistics, and stewardship. And the West transformed. Where chaos once ruled, towns thrived. Rail lines stitched the interior into a continent-wide network. Markets, schools, newspapers, and banks appeared almost overnight. What had been open plains became organized states, booming with commerce and community. The lawlessness didn't vanish. It evolved. Smugglers, corrupt officials, and gangs didn't disappear. They adapted to the new systems. But they no longer defined the West. The open range might have shrunk, but civilization had grown in its place. Cowboys had done their job. They had moved wealth, connected regions, and turned wild lands into productive territories. They hadn't just delivered meat, they had delivered the West itself. And with that, the frontier shifted from myth to map, from chaos to commerce, and from endless opportunity to a structured, thriving nation. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe our channel The Curious Corner, for more fascinating content.